Yeah.
I'm having fun. Yeah, so basically, you know, the topic of discussion was, what if Zelda Ura was released? What if the N64DD was a success? So that's a lot of ifs there, and you know, I've been asked this before, and you know, I've kind of boiled down what I think would have had to have happened for it to be a success in the first place.
Is this it skipping like, okay, what if this had happened? Was what, over 20 years ago, or 22 years ago, the N64DD had come out and it was a success instead.
Yeah, like 98, 99.
To how is everything different now? Or are we going to go through like a little timeline of events and how those are different?
I would say like
what's our structure here? Like
a brief timeline of events. Like
okay.
That,
all right.
I have my full timeline on the wall over there. You can't see it. Every decision that you know, Nintendo would have made differently. Yeah, so I think kind of boils down to a couple different things. You know, I think I actually wrote notes here, so you're going to see me looking at them here.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, I think you know, the DD was released in the twilight years of the console, right? And like we mentioned earlier, oftentimes you get revisions toward the end of a console to kind of expand its life, but realistically the DD was intended to be released much earlier and have nearly the full life cycle of the 64 at its disposal. But this did not happen, so essentially it was dead on arrival, right? So they just could not have been successful. It was impossible. They released in Japan practically as a courtesy, and then never released in the US, and then just it dissipated. No one cared, right? So it would have had to have been released earlier. You also have to keep in mind when it was released, and even when it was like kind of when they thought of it, like when they were kind of the inception of the DD, it was already outdated tech. It was interesting tech, but essentially they were using a zip drive that had 60 megabytes on it instead of 100, which was your average zip drive size, right? Mm-hmm. So the 64 megabytes was much bigger than carts at the time, but 64 carts ultimately got to 64 megabytes anyways. So I think like Conker's Bad Fur Day is an example of one that maxed out the full size of the cartridge, 512 megabits, 64 megabytes. So basically that particular aspect of it, you could still have the read-write, but the size, which was the big thing, you know, complete with the PlayStation, or compete with the PlayStation, you know, in terms of the size of the discs, no longer mattered toward the end of the life cycle. So realistically, I think for it to have been successful, I think that the N64 would have had to have been the disk drive, meaning that it was never the 64 that we know. Maybe it had a cartridge slot like the Saturn did on top for additional RAM or what have you, but it would have just had to have been a zip drive-based console for it to have been successful, and that was the way that it started at the very beginning, because add-ons are never really successful. They just, in the history of games and gaming consoles, they're rarely ever successful.
Looking at you, Sega.
Yeah. So, you know, and you know, Luigi Blood brings up a good point here. We talked about it being in the twilight years of the console. You know, he said by the time the 64 actually released in 1999, the Dreamcast was already released worldwide. You know what I mean? So it's like, what would you rather do? You know, buy a Dreamcast? Or, you know, maybe wait for the GameCube, or get the 64 DD, right? Assuming it was even released in the US, which it wasn't. So, you know, I think, you know, if you bring in Ura Zelda, you know, if it was released, obviously we would have not been talking about this right now. I think that it would have been a great game. You know, what it would have been is up to speculation. I think we're getting more information about, you know, what was promised and what was ultimately going to be released, but I think that it would have changed the trajectory of how Nintendo dealt with the internet, mostly, because the system was an internet-based, internet-capable machine. RandNet was an internet service. It had email. It was designed to allow you to share pieces of art that you created in the different Mario studios. They had a bunch of other Mario Studio games in development that they never released that would have allowed you to basically piece together a game, kind of like Mario Maker, but like years before, because you basically would be creating a polygon here, and a film here, and a drawing here, and there was one that was supposed to be music, there was one that was supposed to be a text editor. You know, like why would you need that as just a game by itself? Well, you wouldn't. You know, you'd want to piece it together with other things that you've created, right? So I think if it was successful theoretically, you know, it would have been successful because of its read-write capabilities and the extra space and blah, 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 but it would have been primarily successful because of the interactivity. So what you probably would have seen was a GameCube that had internet access. I think 1 or 2 games maybe did, I don't know. What you probably would have seen is a Wii with a Nintendo that wasn't deathly afraid of the internet. And a Nintendo that wasn't deathly afraid of voice chat, like it still is, more or less, right? You would have seen a Wii U that, same thing, better internet capabilities, voice chat, like, you know, it just would have, I think it would have opened up Nintendo to things like DLC, because Ura Zelda was essentially DLC, but it wasn't downloadable, right? So it's just additional expansion-based content. And Nintendo actively avoided anything like that, really, until Mario Kart 8, you know? Or like that era, like the Wii U era, midway through its life was the first time it really started doing any sort of DLC, right? And it had just spat on the idea of it prior. So I think the idea of Ura Zelda and the idea of the N64DD failing was put like a phobia into Nintendo, and I think that it set them, really put them off to those concepts. So in terms of a timeline, I don't know, but I really think that you've seen consoles that were more compatible internet-wise and more competitive internet-wise to their contemporaries, like the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Xbox, what have you. So there was a very long monologue. I prepared all day for it.
Yes, but I loved it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So
yeah, and then
oh,
actually,
sorry.
pardon me I just want to interrupt real quick here. Luigi Blood, he's just the man. He's like, you know, he's talking about the Satellaview in the chat. The Satellaview was essentially like DLC content, right? So it's like they were experimenting, then the DD came out, and then it failed. You know, yes. He also mentioned that the storm calmed down with all the Nintendo talks. We're not allowed to talk about Xbox again. Nice. So, you know, you can kind of see the pattern. They're ramping up toward internet use with the Satellaview, with the DD, and then they're just like, screw it. Never again. So I apologize for interrupting. Go ahead.
No, we were going. I was going to bring up the exact same thing. Comment here about Satellaview, but it makes me think. You know, if you think about what Nintendo was doing,
right, we are adding a 4th member to the call, so it makes so like it just helps with the formatting.
Layouts.
Yeah. Yes.
Who are we bringing in?
Ilya.
Our stand-in co-host.
Yeah, and our voiceover person. I asked her and Holly said she was too sweaty, so.
Well, all right then.
Well.
Oh, hello, Ilya.
Hello.
Hi.
All right.
Oh, she quiet, Ilya.
Quiet.
You're so. I don't know if it's just me.
Maybe
you're so quiet.
Set up correctly.
Oh yeah, what I'm thinking is to continue.
Is it better now?
It's good. If it's bad, I can.
I wasn't using my microphone. Now it's using my microphone.
Oh, it's good enough. Don't worry about it. I can adjust it on my end.
Don't listen to Jesse.
I never do. So.
Sorry,
but
you
yeah,
can listen to
well, I'm still on the train of thought here. Thinking about what they were doing with internet access at the time of the Satellaview in Japan, especially competing with the kind of internet stuff that Sega was starting to try and ramp up and do at that time as well. Basically, they would have had to have kept that internet usage as part of their competitive markets and keeping up with that. So what we have now and what we were getting with the Wii U as far as internet goes was basically, in my head, like 2 generations behind what it could have been if they had stayed the course. But we're still stuck in this era of, like you said, no voice chat. Friend codes are still a thing, which is a really dated thing that we shouldn't have still. Things like that. And I just feel like what kind of like Nintendo could be doing PlayStation Live or PSN, sorry, and Xbox Live. They could be that level of internet, but they almost in the same way that with the movies, like they saw the Mario Bros movie came out, that didn't go so well, and they're like, no, never again, until only now again, or they're trying to they're dipping their toes in again. But it just makes it gets my brain tingling so much thinking about like what even the GameCube could have been doing at the time. With this internet, because it's not just like, okay, this is something they had going and we're starting to play around with, but it's like this is something they would have had to have stayed competitive in the market with.
Yeah.
Just my thought there.
Yeah, I also want to bring up.
Do you know what we're talking about even? We just jumped back in when you were, coming on here.
Yeah.
We're talking about stuff that didn't release, so it's okay if you did if you don't know.
No, I had it going while I was making
Okay.
Yeah.
presentable.
Well, you can.
Like, there's crap all over my bed.
Right. Yeah, you can just listen along and jump in for the ending mailbag.
I guess, correction to what I was saying, thanks to Luigi Blood again. Man, we should just bring him on.
Luigi Blood. I did a podcast with him once. It was awesome.
Oh, right on. He said Satellaview does not use internet. It was one-way download, so online play is technically not possible. True. So it was broadcast satellite.
Yeah.
And so at that time, yes. But, that just is like the gateway of internet access.
So you're talking about the Super Famicom?
Yeah, the Super Famicom.
Because you did a video a month ago about like a possible N64 disk drive compatible version with the Satellaview or something like that?
Kind of. Just to backtrack a little bit, yeah, I mean, like, Luigi Blood is technically right, it's not the internet, but I generally call it like a proto-internet, because you can get downloadable content, it functions like the internet, but it's not, so yes, technically that is correct, that it is not. But yeah, so the prototype that you're referring to has no name, it has a patent number, was never announced, never released, but basically it was an N64 add-on. Didn't have a disk drive, anything like that, so it wasn't a DD thing.
Okay.
It was its own entity that would have essentially, theoretically, functioned like a Satellaview or a multimedia device. Not saying that it would have had like a broadcast satellite, it would have been internet connected. It had a hard drive in it, so in theory you could go online, download games. It would function as a cable tuner for your TV, that kind of thing. Not much else is known about it unless you really want to dive in to the like specs in the patent. But it was internet capable, and but it was prototype. The board, the date on the board of the prototype was 1999. So think about that. The N64DD was released in 1999. So when it was a prototype, probably 96, right? So you got to imagine, would Nintendo have ever released N64 add-on in like 2002? I really do think that they were just experimenting. I really don't think it had anything to do with anything they were intentionally going to release, but they were just playing around with internet stuff, and probably partially because of the DD failure, they're like, let's not do anything else with this.
Yeah. But I mean, like, if RandNet had continued to exist, this opens the door for so many online possibilities, or what the GameCube could have been doing.
Oh yeah.
And even if even the possibility of more add-ons for future consoles, I think the GameCube does have a add-on slot for the Game Boy Advance connector, but I don't remember if that's exactly what it's called.
I think there's another
Game Boy player.
There's another add-on I believe lets you connect online for games like Phantasy Star Online on the GameCube was online, and it had like a giant keyboard controller.
Or also in kind of a different category than the add-on N64DD. Like the 64DD and that other device are like complete system changers, whereas like that didn't really solve an existing need or want. Whereas the Game Boy player is like, hey, you want to play Game Boy on your TV?
Yeah,
I do. So.
Yeah, but I mean, like, even just the fact that that port is there, I don't know. It implies to me there could have been, if the DD had gone well, instead of the Game Boy connector, Who knows what else they started adding on to every console. It's like if it had gone well, you know, they like to kind of play the course for what's working with them. At times.
And if it doesn't work, they get super skittish. And like, think about 3D. Think about the Virtual Boy. You know, like it failed, and they didn't try 3D again until the 3DS. And the Virtual Boy was released in like '95, I think. Yeah, it was somewhere around '95. So, and they didn't mess with that again for like a decade and a half.
Yeah,
or more. I don't remember when the 3DS came out, but a long time.
I think it was 2000. I want to say 10 or 11.
I think so. Yeah,
something around that range. So, yeah, I mean,
about a decade and a half.
They got spooked.
Yeah. So the a second part of this, we talked a little bit about how would the Nintendo consoles or the Nintendo landscape be if the disk drive was a success. But if the disk drive was a success, that would have meant games like Ura Zelda would have released, and then wasn't there a Mario 64 2 that was planned for the disk drive as well, or is that speculation?
The Mario 64 2 never really got far. Miyamoto had said that it was like they had created like a working demo, and it was kind of not super functional because they were trying to do 2-player, and they kind of scrapped it. I don't recall that being for the DD. That could be wrong, but I don't think it was scrapped. Even if it was for the DD, it wasn't scrapped because of the DD. It was scrapped because what they were trying to implement couldn't be done on the N64 properly.
All right, that's what I was, because I remember something. I don't know if it was an article by someone who was trying to look up information secondhand, or if it was an actual interview from like a first-hand source like Miyamoto, but I thought I seen something where they mentioned the reason that it was on the disk drive was for the extra processing power to allow it to be multiplayer.
The DD doesn't really give you extra processing power. It has a 32-bit coprocessor, but the games aren't. And Luigi Black can probably speak a little bit more technically to this, but the N64DD does require the expansion pack, so you have that. It does give you more space than the average cart, and it does give you read-write capabilities. So basically that meaning that you can change the game environment to your liking, like a God simulator like Notion, but it doesn't really give you any more power, I don't believe.
I think the big change is that read-write capability, because you mentioned before, and as we've mentioned in past podcasts talking about Ura Zelda, if you cut grass, it would stay cut, for example. Or I think Miyamoto mentioned in interviews like leaving footprints in the sand. Oh my lord, leaving footprints in the sand and it then kind of like staying there. Even though I feel like that would be, in my opinion, a huge waste of space. Even in modern games, they disappear after a bit. But I digress. Just that capability, that's the big change between what the N64 can already do versus what Ura Zelda promised. And other than the additional content as well, which I think as far as the extra space goes, it's more just that you've got the storage that's on the cart and then also the storage that's on the disc. Not so much the extra processing power, which is like kind of a beast into itself. Though I'm far less of the expert than Tony. But that's as far as my understanding goes.
That's why we have Tony here. So another thing that I was wanting to touch on was if every fan wishes Ura Zelda would have released, but if it would have, that would have meant a lot of people's favorite Zelda games would have either not existed or have been completely different, because Miyamoto's gone on interviews saying that some of the dungeons that were scrapped from Ura Zelda were like broken apart and reused in later games like Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and ideas were reused and everything. So, and especially with Majora's Mask, I think it was made out of necessity from Aonuma, where he wanted to work on another Nintendo 64 game because there were so many ideas that was left out from Ocarina of Time's Ura expansion, and Miyamoto wanted to just move on and work on something for the GameCube. So they made the deal that if they could finish it within 1 year, then they could work on the second 64 game, which ended up becoming Majora's Mask.
Miyamoto,
So-
the current gen game killer.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we're gonna work on another game, and he's like, no,
So
we're doing the next generation.
yeah. So Tony, do you think if Ura would have released, would that have erased Majora's Mask from history?
Most likely, yeah. Because they likely utilized ideas like, yeah, the whole mask thing, it originated in Ocarina of Time. You probably wouldn't have gotten that. The reason why it was created is because the developer was getting bored with kind of recreating a game, you know, versus doing something new, right? So Majora's Mask really spawned from boredom with Ura Zelda, right? I think that probably would have erased Majora's Mask, honestly. I mean, maybe we would have gotten something like it down the line, possibly, but I don't think it would have been the same thing.
Yeah, and then
Because the resources would have been spent elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
yeah, that was I believe the reason they were able to build the 4 dungeons within that year was because a lot of the puzzles and stuff was just repurposed from Ura, so they were able to quickly get through it. And then he said,
sorry.
I was actually going to say the same thing that you were about to say, I believe. So
Which was?
okay, if I am a mind reader, you were going to say how Al Newman Miyamoto said that it was reused for later games as well.
Yes.
So
He
yeah.
is a mind reader, folks.
Yeah. So that would have, you know, a domino effect would have happened to where Wind Waker might have been a bit different, Twilight Princess could have been a bit different, and then, yeah, like it would have just kept going, and then maybe by the time we got to Skyward Sword, things would have equaled out to where, you know, it would have been similar to the game that we have now, or without Majora's Mask, it could have just completely changed all of the stuff. Instead of getting
Kind of that butterfly effect, and it just ripples into the whole rest of the series.
yeah. So
Hard to speculate, you know,
Yeah.
but it's probably something like that would have happened.
all right, I guess we're ready to move on to the mailbag if everybody else is good. Does anyone else
Sure.
have anything to add?
don't think so.
When the Virtual Boy came out, July 21st, 1995. You were right. It was like
Yes.
almost an exact month after I was born, which someone in the chat was
Whoa.
like,
Oh my
"You're so
god.
old." I'm like, sorry.
I don't want to do math right now. I don't want
So, did you say July 1st?
July 21st.
Oh, 21st. So
Okay.
the Virtual Boy is
It's
almost 23.
years old.
Wow.
I have a Virtual Boy in my
I'm going. I'm leaving. I'm old.
Old man Tony.
Old.
Old man Tony going to
So
town.
damn old. Every time I meet someone in their 20s, first off, I don't personally believe anyone could be born in the 90s. But I guess it's true.
I don't believe anyone could
Uh-oh.
be born in the early 2000s. That shocks me.
That always.
Yeah, I know.
gets
So,
me.
but
I know
just
someone-
like, I just want you to do me a favor, okay, young lady,
Okay.
and just
Sure.
enjoy your 20s. Okay, you just take life and grab onto it. Okay, because you're only 20 for 10 years or so, and
No, I'm saying
you
You're only
gotta
20
you
for
gotta, you
1
gotta
year.
treasure every damn moment. Okay, you just
I will try.
when you wake
I've
up.
already sacrificed 3 years of it, but
One horrible day when you wake up in the morning and you take your last breath as a 20-year-old and you become a 30-year-old, you'll realize exactly what I mean. So just enjoy.
Oh.
better than Daniel, am I?
It's so funny that I had this coworker once. I was her supervisor, and we're talking about it. And she mentioned that she was born in '98. And
That's weird.
I was
Not
like,
good.
oh no, I remember '98. It was a good year. I remember playing Zelda, and just like,
See?
and it's just,
Because that's when
I
Zelda came
was-
out, or Ocarina of Time.
yeah. Well, exactly. Ocarina of Time is what I was talking to her about. And then she was like, no, I have that game. Girl,
I think you cut out there for a second.
You cut out for a second.
Oh, just and then I was telling her
about.
Yeah, and she's like, no, I have that game. I played on my 3DS. It's not that old. And I'm like, we need to talk.
Remaster. You don't understand.
You're fired. No.
No, I like the people that call Ocarina of Time the first Zelda game. They aren't aware of the ones that came before.
Yeah. By the way, there's a comment.
And had that issue.
There's a couple comments here in the chat that say what Tony says is. So just.
Oh yes.
Just. I am the old man in the cave giving you the sword. Okay.
Yeah.
You listen to the old man now.
I have a poster that says Go Alone, but it's not. It's a Zelda crossover with something else, so it doesn't actually say. It does say take this, but it's a different image.
All right. So I guess we can move on to the mailbag. Before we get started, everybody that's watching, you 32 people, I think we had more watching while we were getting set up, but then they just left because of all the technical issues. So for the 32 people who stayed, thank you. All right. So since this is the mailbag, should have gave one for the discussion topic as well. I'm going to do a new intro because it'll go up as a separate video. So is everybody ready?
Everybody's ready.
All right. Again, people in the chat, just get your questions in there so we can go through and pick them. All right.